This is Darius Khambata's first interview ever. He's agreed to talk only because he wants to share his views on a few important issues in the news. We are delighted to listen. Mr. Khambata is one of Mumbai and India's best known lawyers. Yet his aversion to publicity has meant few know much about his professional life. He studied law at Harvard and returned to join Iqbal Chagla's chambers. That experience was invaluable, he says.
Many matters. I remember the Indian Express group of matters in the early 1990s. Tremendous set of matters where we got a chance to work with really the leading legal minds of that time. Fali Nariman, Ram Jethmalani, Chidambaram, Arun Jaitley, Mr. Chagla, a host of people, Ram Jethmalani, and we'd all tootle off to Madras and spend, I think, 2 weeks of the month there. Matter shifted to Delhi, so another week there. So we were, for about 2 years, a lot of travel, a lot of interesting work in that matter. There were other big matters as well. There was the ANZ Brindley's arbitration against National Housing Bank, which went on for 2 or 3 years. All these matters raised very complex issues of law, and as juniors it was fascinating to research. It was fascinating to see how our research got translated into advocacy in court. It was a learning process. In fact, this profession is always a learning process. I'm learning even today. So yeah, those were two of the matters I can think of. There were several others, obviously. But I think for me those two were defining matters in the early 1990s.
Defining in the sense of the complexity of the cases, the work that you had an opportunity to do, or for other reasons, for instance, the judgments that were issued?
I think defining because of the work that I got to do, because of the interaction that I had with other lawyers, how I learned how a matter develops. I think I learned how to present a matter in court, because a lawyer is much more than just someone who knows the law. It's really an amalgam of qualities that you have to have. Research and knowledge of law is of course one of them.
Sure.
But advocacy, how you analyze the case, strategy in court, all these things are important. And in this profession you learn by a process of osmosis. You learn from your seniors and your contemporaries.
How important was it for you to have worked with a senior like Iqbal Chagla to get the right start to your career?
I think critically important, because what he taught us, and only by example, never by lecture, was values. Values in the profession, how it's important to have those values, and that winning a case at any cost is not a value. It's doing a good job and doing the best for your client and acting fairly as an officer of the court.
After working with Iqbal Chagla, Darius started his own practice. But he put that on hold when offered the job of Additional Solicitor General.
Your 5 years in government service, I think you've sort of been in the midst of some landmark cases. For instance, I'll mention the Adarsh case, which was a political earthquake in this state, so to speak, and in this city. What do you take away from those 5 years in government service, both with the centre as well as with the state then as Advocate General?
I think, again, fair amount of misconception about what it means to be a law officer. I think several law officers before me have shown that you have to be independent. You are not a spokesperson for the government. You should not be. You have to exercise an independent will and sense of judgment. Having said that, you are obviously still a lawyer appearing for a party, which is the government. So you do your best for them. And you're not a vigilante. You're not going around trying to look up trouble or look for exposés. You are a lawyer. But you try to impart to the officers and to the politicians and ministers you deal with a sense that there is right and there is wrong. They may not always understand that, but they always respect that. And I found that in my 5.5 years, there were very, very few occasions when I had to actually put my foot down and insist on taking a particular course of action. I found very often powers of persuasion worked. There are some excellent officers working both in the central and the state government. Brilliant minds, dedicated, committed officers. I'm not going to name any because I don't want to exclude any. But there are people I've come across who are really tremendous assets to our country. and they're working silently. They see the force of logic and fairness. They don't always take a stand that is bureaucratic or unfair. There's of course a vast number of bureaucrats who are not willing to take decisions. That's really the biggest problem for a law officer, to get proper instructions and to get a decision taken. But a number of them also require security. If you're willing to say that I'll get up in court and I'll defend your decision because I think it's right, then a surprisingly large number of them are willing to take decisions. It's when they're not so protected, or when from higher ups they don't get the assurance that their decisions will be protected and defended, that they then lapse into not taking decisions.
You know, this is an interesting insight, sir, because I think the time that you spent in government, both centre and state, was a time that India was witnessing probably its worst policy paralysis period ever. You know, and it was also the time when the CAG was issuing report after report indicating wrongdoings in the way contracts were given out, natural resources were shared. And so this gives us a bit of insight into the sort of the impact of what was happening at that point in time. You were in the middle of a big corruption case. What did you take away from how the government deals with this?
Obviously, I'm not going to speak of any particular case, but if you have a case where there are allegations of corruption, it's your duty to take up whatever defenses are available in law in that case. But it is certainly not your duty to protect the corrupt or to shelter a trail which leads to corruption. It is your duty to make sure that the investigative agencies do their job and to do it well. You have to sometimes nudge them, you have to give them that support, and you have to give them the assurance that if they do their job, they'll be protected ultimately from maybe vendettas from politicians, etc. As I said, I don't think it's the role of a law officer to become a vigilante. But the line is where it's a very grey line, because there are cases where you do need to go into the files, you do need to ask searching questions to your officers. And the policy I adopted, and I made that very plain to the officers who came to me, was that if I know a material fact which I feel is material to the case, I will disclose it to the court. I'm not going to be party to suppressing facts or to misleading the court. That's out of the question. If you have a defense, I'm willing to argue that a mistaken decision need not necessarily be a corrupt one, and that you have to be given policy space. But I'm not willing to argue when I know that you've taken a deliberately corrupt decision. And I did do that in many matters, actually. So I didn't broadcast it, and I'm not going to broadcast it now. But
not to ask.
I
know you won't. I know you won't.
And I think that worked.
How difficult was that? Were you ever fearful that this might lead to the termination of your services as a law officer, or that it might lead to, vendetta in future cases if you return to private practice?
I'll tell you a couple of things. One is, I would have been delighted if that had led to my resignation, because I'm not one who would hanker after either of these offices, and I would have been quite happy to demit them several months ago or years ago. I just felt it was my duty to serve out my term. Having said that, I got tremendous support from the previous Chief Minister, Prithviraj Chavan. I think he's a wonderful man, a man of integrity. He's professional in his approach. He's committed to development. He had his share of problems, which were not really my concern. They were political issues. But I think I got tremendous support from him. He was also the law minister, and he did support me in a number of tough decisions that I insisted on taking. So I am truly grateful to him. I don't think I could have survived if there had been someone different in office.
Why did you decide then to stop being Advocate General? Because it was on your wish that you didn't want to continue, and therefore your resignation thereafter.
You're right. I had made it plain to them about a year ago, actually, that I was not interested in continuing beyond October in any view of the matter, even had the previous government returned.
Right.
That's because, Menka, I've done 5.5 years as law officer. That office carries inherent stresses and pressures in many ways. One, you don't often get enough assistance in court. You have to do a lot of spade work on your own. That's one. Two, you don't always get the correct instructions. You have to ferret out facts. You have to look for documents yourself, something that one is not used to as a private lawyer. You get cases where, in some cases, you're not sure whether your officers want you to win the matter. I mean, an assumption we have in private matters is that your client wants to win.
Yes.
That's not always the case when you are instructed in government. You have to want to win, and you have to want to do the right thing for government. Not always win. You have to concede some matters. You have to win some matters, and you have to take that call. So all this carries with it a fair amount of collateral pressure and stress. And I think you can do it for this long and maybe not much longer. So I think 5.5 years is good going.
Corruption is endemic in almost every phase of our life here in India. More so when you interact with the government. Given that you were in the thick of many corruption cases, in situations when you know a corrupt act has taken place, and yet you are the government's defender, in that sense, what did you do?
I'll tell you, most of these cases were at the investigation stage or pre-investigation. What I did was to ensure that the investigative agency at least learnt from me that it had freedom of action. And in some cases I actually had to nudge them along, and they did respond positively. It was not my role in a matter to actually go through the files and come to a conclusion of corruption or not. That had to be left to the court and had to be left to the investigative agencies. But having said that, if in a particular case I felt that there was something untoward, and there were cases where certain orders had been passed, actions had been taken which I was not at all comfortable with, I did offer the government the option of pulling back, of saying we will retract that order, pass a fresh order, or go to another officer. And in some cases they did take my advice.
And in many they didn't.
Where they didn't, in some cases I've actually returned the brief.
You have?
I have.
And
yes,
you can do that as a law officer?
I'm not sure whether I can or cannot, but I
you did. Okay.
Because I was certainly not going to get up and defend something that was indefensible. In many other cases I went to court, and I'd given prior notice of this to the government. I went to court and I conceded. It's not my duty as a law officer to defend the indefensible. So there will be a lot of grey area. Perhaps some will say that case X or Y, you should have conceded this one, you shouldn't have fought that one.
You used your best.
That's a matter of judgment, and I don't claim infallibility, but it's the approach that's important.
The reason I asked you this is because, I think, of course, as a law officer, your client is the Constitution, if I understand that correctly. It's not the government of the day.
I always used to tell even the government lawyers on the panel that remember, you're representing either the Union of India or the state of Maharashtra. You're not representing the government of the day.
Yes, absolutely. And unfortunately, we've seen this happen with several senior lawyers in Delhi as well, where if they or their opinions did not match the views of the government of the day, they have been indecorously asked to go and have bared vendetta thereafter. Again, I'm not taking names here because I know you will not comment on specific people. But that has happened, unfortunately, in this country. The government seems to be under the impression that law officers represent the government of the day, not the Constitution.
Well, whatever be your client's impression, you have to do what duty calls. Clearly, law officers don't represent that particular bureaucrat or minister who's instructing them in a matter. They represent the government of the day in the sense that that government carries the executive authority of the Union of India or the state government. But they don't represent it to the extent that you allow the person in power to corrupt the system or to pervert the system. There's a clear line, and in most cases you can make out what's happening.